In a video last month, I showed you how you can take the spacing recommendations from seed packets and adapt them to intensive planting strategies like square foot gardening. I do this myself with a number of crops, including carrots, onions, beets, and zucchini. But there are also times when I completely ignore the spacing recommendations on seed packets. Today I'll share some examples of intensive planting strategies I use where seed packet spacing just doesn't apply. One of the ways I make the most out of our limited growing space is to grow vertically. And when I do, I usually follow the spacing recommendations from Mel Bartholomew's book, Square Foot Gardening. For example, here to my left, I'm growing 2 winter squash, an acorn and a butternut, up the same trellis that's roughly 4 by 8 feet. While just one acorn squash plant can take up 20 square feet of garden space when grown on the ground, I'm able to grow an acorn and a butternut up the same trellis and use only 4 square feet of ground space along the base of the trellis. So by growing these 2 plants vertically, I allow them to take up 32 square feet of vertical space instead of sprawling out all over the garden, and I only end up using 4 square feet in the garden bed itself. Now I should say that not all winter squash can be grown 2 per trellis. For example, here on this trellis, I have only 1 cushaw squash plant, and that's really all the trellis can handle. Now let's take a look at another crop I grow vertically, following the square foot garden spacing recommendations. I grow peas and pole beans up trellises and space them 8 per square foot along the bottom of the trellis. That's 32 plants per trellis. This is much more intensive than the recommended 4 to 6 inch spacing on my seed packets, which would only give me 8 to 12 plants in the same amount of space. Now let's look at one last example of how I grow vertically using square foot garden spacing. I prune our indeterminate tomatoes by removing the suckers, and I grow them up trellises on the north or sometimes the west side of our garden beds. Pruning allows me to space them just 1 per square foot, which allows me to grow 9 plants in the same amount of space I could grow 1 plant if following the spacing recommendations on the seed packet. So pruning probably gives me lower production per plant. I should get a greater overall yield from 9 pruned plants than 1 unpruned plant. I could give you many more examples of square foot garden spacing recommendations, but rather than do that, I've provided a link in the description to a document that provides those spacing recommendations for us. Now let's move beyond square foot gardening and look at some other intensive planting strategies I'm using. Seed packets usually recommend a spacing of 12 to 18 inches for peppers, but out in the front yard garden, I'm growing 2 peppers per 7-gallon grow bag. This spacing may not be optimal for getting the most production from 1 plant, but I should get more production overall from growing 2 plants in a grow bag instead of just 1. When I plant peppers in the ground, I usually space them 10 to 12 inches apart instead of the recommended 12 to 18 inches. I also plant cut and come again greens closer than the square foot gardening spacing. These greens include lettuce, spinach, chard, mustard greens, any green where you can harvest the leaves as the plant matures rather than having to wait until the plant is fully grown before harvesting. For example, here to my right, I have Swiss chard planted just a few inches apart. Because I keep coming back to these plants again and again to harvest leaves, they don't take up as much space, and they don't need the 6 to 12 inches that's typically recommended. And when I transplant these lettuce plants into the garden this fall, I'll plant them only 3 to 4 inches apart. Not only will I be using a cut and come again approach to harvesting the lettuce, but growth will also be slowed by the shorter daylight hours and lower temperatures, so they won't need the 6 to 8 inches that's typically recommended. Another technique I use to maximize space is to plant fast-growing small crops in the spaces between larger, slow-growing, but immature plants. For example, here in the front yard garden, I planted cherry bell radishes between my cabbage plants. The cherry bells only need 22 days to grow to maturity, so they should be ready to harvest before the cabbage plants need this space. A similar approach is to grow shade-tolerant plants in the understory of taller plants. For example, here we're growing kale underneath our Asian pears. We're also growing King Stropharia mushrooms under our blackberries. Finally, every year I try new experiments to push the limits of intensive planting in my garden. For example, here I have indeterminate tomatoes and pole beans growing up the hoops of my hoop house, and I'm getting excellent production out of both. The pole beans don't seem to be affected by the tomatoes at all, and even if the tomatoes are producing a little bit less because they're shaded by the pole beans, I'm still getting more tomatoes than I would if I hadn't planted these tomatoes here at all. Well, that's all I have for today. I'm always looking for new ways to grow more food. So if you have some intensive planting strategies that I haven't talked about here today, please let me know in a comment below. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe for more videos on how to grow a lot of food on little land without spending much or working harder than you have to. Let's go inside, bud. Ready?